Chapter 1. The Call That Ends Everything. Mason Hale had always liked the quiet hour before noon, the one window of the day when the rest of Echelon Global hadn't yet erupted into a chorus of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and people pretending to be more important than they were. His desk sat tucked into the corner of the analytics wing, far from the CEO's glass palace and the fluorescent chaos of middle management. Here, surrounded by data streams glowing across triple monitors, he could breathe. He leaned forward, scanning a cluster of anomaly curves on his left screen. The model was drifting again, subtle, small enough that no one else would notice, but he felt it like a tug behind his ribs. He adjusted a fragment of code, tapped enter, and watched the curve correct itself like a heartbeat snapping back into rhythm. Then his phone buzzed. He didn't look at it at first. Calls during work hours were rare. Calls from her were rarer. Belle had long ago stopped involving him in anything beyond obligatory events and cold company updates. She liked to pretend their marriage was a polished partnership, something she could present to investors without embarrassment. Behind closed doors, she barely tolerated his presence. The phone buzzed again. He reached for it, expecting a calendar alert or perhaps a reminder to pick up dry cleaning, something impersonal. But it wasn't that. Belle, wife, flashed across the screen. He frowned. She never phoned him directly. She preferred memos, emails, or delegated messages through her assistant. She ran their household with the same CEO efficiency she ran the company. He answered anyway. Belle. For a heartbeat. There was only the soft hum of the office around him. Then her voice slid through the speaker, smooth, controlled, and chillingly distant. Mason, she said. Good. You picked up. He sat back slowly. Something in her tone wasn't right. It was rehearsed. It was stiff, like she was reading from a script. What's going on? He asked. In the interest of efficiency, she began, I'll get straight to the point. That alone told him everything. Belle never rushed unless she wanted to avoid argument or questions. She inhaled, exhaled softly, and continued. We're downsizing. Mason blinked. Downsizing? Since when? It was a board decision, she said in a voice almost too casual. Echelon needs to streamline, so we're letting a few non-essential roles go. A cold crawl started down Mason's spine. Non-essential roles? Yes, she confirmed, including yours. He waited for her to laugh, or say it was temporary, or explain it was some kind of restructuring. But Belle Hale, his wife, didn't hesitate. Mason, she said clearly, today is your last day. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak yet. He listened as she continued, crisp and merciless. You'll need to pack your things immediately. HR is sending paperwork to your company email. Please vacate your workspace by noon. Mason stared at the phone, not trusting himself to speak. 5 years. 5 years building the engine that made Echelon a global titan. And she was discarding him like a used stapler. But Belle wasn't finished. If, she added, you want to stay with the company in some capacity, there's another option. He raised an eyebrow. Which is? Another voice snickered faintly in the background. Myra, Belle's sister. The perpetual shadow, always hovering near power, always eager to mock what she envied. Belle cleared her throat. Facilities is short-staffed. They need custodial help. So, if you want to stay on as a janitor, we can arrange that. Myra burst into laughter behind her. Mason let the silence stretch. He could almost see Belle's smug little smirk through the phone, the one she used whenever she believed she'd risen above someone. A janitor, he repeated softly. Belle's tone brightened, falsely cheerful. It's honest work, Mason, and I'm being generous by even offering it. He rested his elbow on the desk, fingers grazing the keyboard idly. She really had no idea. She didn't know what he owned, what he controlled, or what he had quietly protected all these years. She thought firing him would make him disappear. Mason, she said when he didn't answer. Do you understand the terms? He finally spoke, voice calm. Yeah, I understand. Good. A rustle of papers sounded, probably her reviewing the HR draft. And one more thing, he waited. Don't come home tonight. His pulse paused. Excuse me. We've already changed the locks. Myra giggled again behind her, whispering something snide. Belle ignored her, continuing smoothly. It's better this way. You'll receive instructions about retrieving any personal belongings you left behind. He straightened in his chair. You changed the locks without telling me? Yes, she said simply. We decided it was best to establish boundaries. So Myra was part of this too. He exhaled slowly and glanced around the analytics floor. Some co-workers glanced his way, sensing tension but pretending not to listen. He turned back to the phone. You really planned this out, he said. Belle didn't deny it. We did. Another harsh snort of laughter from Myra. You should have seen her face writing the termination notice. I told her you wouldn't take it well. Belle sighed at her sister. Myra, please. The two women muttered for a moment, the phone muffling their bickering. Mason sat very still. Not angry. Not broken. Just awake. Myra's voice rose again. Tell him the best part. Belle hesitated, then added, yes. Well, considering your past behavior and your tendency to overreact, we've requested that security escort you from the building. He let out a small, disbelieving breath. Security. For me. It's protocol, Belle insisted. It's petty, he returned softly. Belle bristled. We're doing what's necessary for the company's protection. And for mine. Myra snorted. For yours, Belle. Definitely yours. A faint irritation flicked across Belle's tone. Regardless, it's done. Mason leaned back in his chair. He could have yelled. He could have demanded explanations, begged for clarity, tried to understand what turned his wife into this boardroom executioner. Instead, he smiled. It formed slowly, quietly, almost peacefully. They thought this would break him. They thought stripping him of his badge and keys and marriage would leave him homeless and helpless. They didn't know what he had built. They didn't know what he still owned. They didn't know what was coming. Well, Mason said, voice smooth, thank you. Belle paused, suspicious. For what? For the amazing offer, he said. Myra choked on her laughter. Belle stiffened. Mason didn't wait for her reaction. He ended the call. Chapter 2, The Asset They Never Owned. Mason didn't speak to anyone on his way out of Echelon Global. He didn't slam drawers, didn't storm through hallways, didn't even give the security guards Belle had called a second glance. The two of them stood awkwardly near the elevators, massive men with uncertain expressions, clearly expecting drama. But Mason only nodded at them politely as he walked past. His calm unsettled them. Good. He swiped his employee badge at the turnstile one last time. The system beeped red. Access revoked already. Belle must have hit submit on HR the moment he hung up. Mr. Hale? One guard asked hesitantly. We're supposed to escort you out. Mason offered a small, almost apologetic smile. You're late. They looked at each other, confused. Then they followed him at a respectful distance, unsure whether they were escorting a fired employee or a man walking out of his own empire. Outside, the cold air hit him in the face like a slap of clarity. The building rose behind him, steel, glass ambition. Belle's monument to her own ego. The logo he designed years ago flashed across the facade in crisp blue. Echelon Global. He didn't look back again. His car, a quiet, unremarkable gray sedan Belle used to complain looked too modest for a man in tech, sat waiting in the parking structure. He clicked the lock, slid in, and exhaled fully for the first time since the call. Home, he murmured to himself. But not the home Belle thought she'd locked him out of. He pulled out of the structure and drove without rush or panic. Traffic moved lazily through the city. Mason blended into it like mist. If someone had been watching, they'd assume he was just another tired mid-level employee on a Tuesday afternoon. No one would guess the man behind the wheel had built Echelon's beating heart. No one, including Belle, knew what else he had built. 40 minutes later, Mason turned down a quiet street line with old brick warehouses and a handful of converted lofts. This area didn't match the polished persona Belle tried to force him into. That was the point. He parked beside a nondescript building whose windows were tinted from the inside. From his pocket, Mason pulled out a small metal key. Not a smart lock, not a fingerprint reader, an actual key with grooves and scratches, the kind that left no digital trace. He slid into the lock of Unit 302 and pushed the door open. The studio apartment swallowed him in a familiar hush. It smelled faintly of coffee, soldering iron, and the colder scent of electronics cooling in the dark. A single wide window illuminated the space, exposed brick, shelves stacked with components, a mattress pushed against the wall, and the gentle hum of several machines resting in sleep mode. This wasn't a home. This was a lab, a sanctuary, a contingency plan. He shut the door behind him and locked it. Only then did he speak aloud. "Well," he murmured, "looks like it's finally time." He set his bag down and crossed the room, flicking on the overhead lights. The studio came alive, rows of monitors, wires snaking across the floor, whiteboards filled with formulas, and in the center of it all, the machine, the real engine. Echelon thought they owned it. Bell believed she commanded it. The board assumed it was tucked away on company servers. They were wrong. Mason approached the central workstation, a setup that made Echelon's data center look like a toy. He pressed the power button. Fans hummed. Light bloomed across the screens. He typed in his password and watched the interface unfold like a living thing. Aurora Engine, root access confirmed. The original predictive analytics system. The skeleton key to Echelon's success. The tool that had landed them government contracts, hedge fund retainers, corporate partnerships. The tool that elevated Bell to CEO. And it had never, not for 1 second, been truly theirs. Years ago, when the company was still a scrappy startup and he was still naive enough to believe marriage and business could mix, Bell had told him to transfer all IP to ensure mutual trust. She slipped him a contract during dinner, smiling sweetly, promising protection. He had kissed her cheek, taken the folder, and filed it in the trash. He'd told her he signed it. She never checked. She always underestimated him. Mason opened a small drawer beneath the workstation. Inside lay a black notebook with a cracked leather cover. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and laid it open on the desk. Sketches of architectures, flow maps, algorithmic branches, fail-safe triggers, hardware notes. Every secret of the system, on paper, in his handwriting, stored nowhere digital. No theft, no breach, no evidence Echelon could claim. He flipped through the pages, the pen strokes familiar, steady. At the back of the notebook was a tab labeled in clean, capital letters. Nova, successor model. He paused on that page, rubbing the corner of the paper with his thumb. Nova wasn't just an upgrade. It was a philosophical shift, transparent, ethical, explainable. A model built to empower, not manipulate. A system he could never have created inside Echelon's suffocating greed. He whispered, "You were always the future, weren't you?" On the next screen, an icon glowed softly. Nova.exe. He didn't open it. Not yet. Not until he knew exactly how he wanted to move. Instead, he took a seat, pulled his chair close to the desk, and rested his hands on the keyboard. What next? He asked himself. It wasn't despair in his voice. It was calculation, possibility, freedom. He clicked open a blank notepad file and began typing, outlining steps, contingencies, timelines, the architecture of the next play. Not revenge, strategy. As he worked, the room filled with the comforting rhythm of keys tapping. Thoughts stabilized into plans. Plans sharpened into routes. Routes converged into purpose. The storm Bell thought she unleashed wasn't chaos. It was ignition. Hours didn't matter. Time blurred. Mason worked until the notepad filled with dozens of bullet points and labeled sections. He flipped to a clean page in his physical notebook and began sketching an expansion to Nova's modular framework. The soft light from the monitors reflected in his eyes. Finally, he sat back, tapping the notebook with his pen. They thought firing him ended his role. They thought locking him out killed his influence. They thought they owned the future he'd built. But the truth sat glowing in front of him, the asset they depended on, bet on, rose on. They never owned it. And now Mason was outlining what comes next. Chapter 3, Pulling the Threads Loose. The next morning, the city was still half asleep when Mason stepped out of his studio. The sky hovered in that pale blue space between dawn and daylight, the kind of morning where sound felt muted and time moved slower, an ideal moment for delicate work. He wore nothing flashy. Dark jeans, a slate jacket, a cap. Anonymity was armor. No one seeing him now would guess he'd once been the architect of Echelon's core. No one would imagine the mission he was on. He walked 3 blocks before hailing a rideshare. Using his own car would record the trip. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't about to give Bell any reason to claim unauthorized access. The rideshare driver glanced at him in the mirror. "Quiet morning," the man said casually. "Perfect for thinking," Mason replied with a polite nod. 10 minutes later, the car pulled up on the east end of the Echelon complex, right where Mason needed to be. Employees typically entered through the grand front lobby, the one Bell used for her photo ops. Mason preferred a different route, a service corridor. Invisible, forgotten, useful. He stepped out and adjusted his cap, then walked toward the side of the building as if he belonged, as if this was simply another Tuesday morning in a life that hadn't been upended by his wife's betrayal. Truth was, his badge wouldn't work anymore. But the data center didn't care about employee status. It cared about credentials. Mason still had those. He reached a restricted door with a metal keypad. He typed the 6-digit code from memory. A short beep. A green light. Access granted. "Good morning to you too," he murmured. Inside, the corridor hummed with machinery. Air vents vibrated with a constant metallic whir. The building's hidden nervous system. Mason walked with steady steps, the sound of his shoes echoing off sterile concrete. 2 employees rounded the corner, both wearing hoodies, both half awake, clutching coffee. "Hey, Mason," one of them asked, squinting. "Didn't know you were on site today." Analytics hiccup, Mason said smoothly. "Just patching something." Usual Tuesday." The guy lifted his cup. "Good luck in there." "It's freezing today." Mason forced a faint smile. "Always is." They moved on without suspicion. Some people rarely questioned things when you sounded like you belonged. He descended a narrow staircase and reached the basement level. The hum grew louder, denser. The sound of heat exchangers, server clusters, and fans battling to keep the brain of Echelon alive. At the end of the hall sat a steel door with a sign. "Data Core, authorized tech access only." Beside it, a biometric scanner glowed. Mason lifted his hand and pressed his finger to it. He expected rejection. Bell had revoked everything else. But after a beep, the scanner flickered green. He almost laughed. "You forgot the most important access point, Bell," he whispered. "You always forget the ones you don't understand." The door unlocked with a heavy clunk. He slipped inside. The data center stretched out like a glowing cathedral, rows upon rows of server stacks, blue LED lights blinking like stars. Cold air blasted from vents overhead, making his breath puff faintly. This was the heart of the company. This was where his work lived. And this morning, this was where he would make sure Echelon learned what it meant to underestimate him. He approached Rack 17, the cluster he built, maintained, optimized, guarded. The one Bell believed was the company's property. He tapped into a maintenance terminal. The screen lit up with familiar lines of code. Aurora Engine. Stability Patch Version 4.6 Predictive Consistency Module Core Calibration Algorithm. To anyone else, it looked like advanced computational architecture. To Mason, it was a map. A map with a few threads he could gently remove. He cracked his knuckles. "All right, Aurora. Time for a little recalibration." He typed with surgical precision. First, he removed a hidden patch, one that corrected long-term drift in output models. Second, he disabled an auto balancer, tiny, unnoticed, but essential for harmonizing datasets. Third, he pulled a cryptic-sounding script that had no documentation, no official mention, nothing that IT could trace quickly. He had written it himself years ago. A single mathematical guardian. Without it, the engine would keep running, but it would get slower, less accurate, confused, fragmented. A slow death. A quiet collapse. No alarms. Exactly what he needed. He paused before hitting enter. It wasn't hesitation, just a moment of reflection. "This didn't have to be your fate," he told the machine softly. "Not if she had respected the one person who built you." He pressed enter. The scripts vanished. The changes committed. The system accepted them without protest. Aurora would run. It just wouldn't run well. Not without him. As he worked, footsteps echoed behind him. Mason turned. A man in a blue tech jacket poked his head around the server stacks. Oh, hey, didn't realize anyone else was down here. Mason relaxed his shoulders. Just finishing a patch cleanup. Yeah. The guy glanced at the terminal. Damn, that's deep-level stuff. Maintenance backlog. Mason replied. You know how it is. The tech groaned. Always something. Then he shrugged. Well, good luck. I'm heading for a smoke. Take your time, Mason said. When the tech left, the silence settled again. Mason took one last look at the lines of code, now subtly altered. Bell wouldn't notice. Myra wouldn't notice. The board wouldn't notice. Not today. Not tomorrow. But soon, like threads pulled from a tapestry, the collapse would reveal itself one delicate rip at a time. He closed the terminal, logged out, and wiped any trace of his input. Then he walked between the glowing server racks toward the heavy steel door. He didn't rush. He didn't hide. He simply moved with the calm of a man who had accepted the truth. They had fired the one person they should have begged to stay. The air warmed as he ascended the stairwell back to ground level. He slipped out the service entrance just as the morning sun stretched across the sky. People were streaming toward the building now, coffee in hand, badges around their necks, eager to prove loyalty to a company they didn't realize was already bleeding. Mason stopped on the sidewalk. He looked up at Echelon Global, its towering glass, the polished steel, the gleaming logo. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel grief. He felt clarity. The threads had been pulled, and the unraveling had begun. Chapter 4. The hidden life Mason always prepared for. The key slid into the old iron lock with a familiar resistance, one that always made Mason exhale, not in frustration, but in relief. This door, unlike the one Bell just barred him from, had never betrayed him. He pushed it open and stepped inside his hidden studio apartment, the place no one at Echelon Global, not even Bell, knew existed. The air held a faint scent of solder, ink, and cooling circuits. It was the smell of his real life, the one he built long before Echelon, long before Bell declared herself visionary, long before her sister Myra strutted through the boardroom like a co-owner of his dreams. Mason closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. The silence wasn't heavy, it was liberating. Home, he murmured. Not the mansion whose locks Bell had already changed. Not the sterile, glass-walled office where he'd spent years building the engine that made Echelon Global the titan it was. This was the real home, his backup life, his contingency world, his sanctuary. He dropped his bag on the small counter and walked toward the far end of the studio where an entire wall hummed with quiet, steady power. Servers blinked in slow, pulsing breaths. Cooling fans whispered like calm ocean waves. His workstation, a curved array of monitors, sat waiting, the screens dark but alive beneath the surface. He brushed his fingers over the polished metal of the main terminal. Let's wake you up. He pressed the power sequence. One by one, the screens lit up, bathing the room in soft blue. The logo he designed years ago, before Bell even knew what predictive analytics meant, flashed across the center screen. A single silver star, pulsing outward like a heartbeat. Then a synthesized voice, warm and steady, greeted him. Welcome back, Mason. Nova, his true creation, his masterpiece. The engine that should have powered Echelon, but never did because he never handed it over. Not the code, not the algorithms, not even the architecture. Bell only ever had the shell, an obsolete version polished to look brilliant, but hollow underneath. Nova was the real thing. Good to see you too, he said, sinking into his chair. He took a deep breath, letting the atmosphere settle around him. Here, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to downplay his intelligence to keep Bell comfortable. He didn't have to tolerate Myra's snide comments about visionaries and forward thinkers who had never built anything more meaningful than a networking circle. He tapped open a secure drive labeled Archive 7. Rows of files unfolded like a map of his mind, schematics, mathematical models, simulation logs, language trees, optimization routines. At the very bottom sat the black notebook icon. He clicked it open. A scanned image of his real black notebook appeared, handwritten designs, diagrams, thoughts, every line drawn by him, every stroke a reminder of long nights and longer instincts. He reached into his bag and pulled the physical notebook out, flipping through it as the digital version mirrored his movements. Mistrust, he murmured. He paused on a page titled, Why I Need a Backup Life. He had written it 3 years ago, long before Belle began calling herself a self-made powerhouse in interviews. He read the bullet points aloud. Because brilliance gets exploited. Because success attracts opportunists. Because even the people closest to you eventually want ownership of what they didn't build. Because someone has to protect the engine. He closed the notebook and exhaled slowly. His intuition had been warning him for years. Belle's sudden obsession with public image. Her fixation on cutting him out of board meetings. The way Myra inserted herself into company decisions without having a single credential beyond being Belle's sister. The way they both started speaking like he was just another employee, not the architect of the entire empire. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. He slid the notebook aside and leaned forward, watching Nova's interface stabilize. Nova, he said, run a system integrity check. Integrity check initiated. Lines of code rushed across the screen. He leaned back, letting the tension uncoil from his shoulders. Here, in these four walls, he wasn't replaced. He wasn't downsized. He wasn't dismissed like an inconvenience. Here, he was the creator. The hum of the servers was almost soothing. The lights outside the apartment window flickered as the evening deepened. Mason stood, stretching his legs, and walked toward the kitchenette. He poured himself a glass of water, watching the condensation gather on the surface. His mind drifted, not to Belle firing him over speakerphone, not to Myra laughing in the background, but to the quiet, subconscious reasons he built this place. He remembered the day he signed the initial partnership contract with Belle. The lawyer had said, business and marriage don't mix cleanly. Mason thought loyalty would override that. He was wrong. He remembered standing in the early echelon server room, wires everywhere, solder burns on his hands. Belle thanking him for being the backbone. He remembered the shift, when she stopped saying thank you at all. He took a sip of water, eyes drifting to the window. Autonomy, he murmured. That was the deeper truth. It wasn't just distrust, it was the need for something that belonged entirely to him. Something no corporate board could seize, no opportunist could dilute, no spouse could claim. Nova chimed. Integrity check complete. All systems optimal. Good, Mason said, returning to the desk. We've got work to do. He opened his contacts list, his real one. Not the corporate Rolodex, not the networking connections Belle constantly bragged about. These are the people who knew him before success, before money, before titles. The professors who respected his mind. The engineers who admired his precision. The entrepreneurs who saw his solutions as revolutionary, not something to plaster on a press release. He hovered over the first name. Dr. Hale, a man who once said, "You're 20 years ahead of the industry, Mason. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Mason clicked open a message window. Let's start rebuilding, he whispered. But he didn't type anything yet. Instead, he let the room settle again. The quiet hum, the pulse of Nova's interface, the faint thrum of electricity running through the walls. This life, the hidden one, wasn't an escape. It was the foundation he always knew he would return to. He set his notebook beside the keyboard, straightened his shoulders, and opened a blank planning grid on the screen. Lines snapped into place as he began outlining the first phase. A clear strategy, a clean slate, a quiet beginning built on absolute control. He wasn't reacting to what Belle did. He was simply resuming what he had always planned. And as Nova's interface glowed steadily in front of him, Mason felt the first real calm he'd had in years. He began to type. Chapter 5, The Man Who Sees Him Clearly. Mason stared at the name on his monitor for a long moment before pressing call. Alton Morrow, not a man you contacted casually, not unless you had something worth his time. And Mason did. He always had. It was Belle and her ego-driven board who never saw it. The call rang twice. Then a crisp, confident voice answered. Mason Clark, I'll be damned. I thought you'd gone full ghost on the industry. Not gone, Mason replied. Just repositioned. A low chuckle. Repositioned? Bell finally pushed you out. Mason paused. Something like that. Good. Alton said without hesitation. You were wasting your talent there. Mason blinked, surprised at the bluntness. Most people danced around Bell's name like it was a sacred brand. But Alton Morrow was not most people. He was one of the few who saw through corporate theatrics. Can we meet? Mason asked. Already clearing my afternoon, Alton said. Where? Mason gave an address, not the Echelon Tower, not his old home, not anywhere Bell monitored. Instead, a quiet rooftop lounge 2 blocks from his hidden studio. I'll be there in 20, Alton said. And Mason, yeah. Bring something worth blowing up my schedule. Mason almost smiled. Trust me, I will. The rooftop lounge was half empty, wide open to the late afternoon sky. Warm light spilled across polished tables and glass railings. Mason arrived early and took a seat in the corner, where he could see every entrance. Alton Morrow arrived exactly on time, tall, silver-haired but sharp-eyed, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Mason's car. His stride held the easy confidence of a man who didn't need to introduce himself. His reputation did that for him. He spotted Mason immediately. Well, hell, Alton said, pulling out a chair. You look like a man who finally dropped a weight he didn't realize he was carrying. Mason exhaled. Something like that. A waiter approached. Alton waved him off. Give us a minute. Then he leaned in, elbows on the table, gaze cutting through everything. All right, tell me why the golden brain of Echelon Global rang me up. Mason didn't bother with small talk. He powered on a slim tablet and placed it between them. The first slide appeared. Nova's architecture map. Alton's eyebrows twitched up. This is not the Echelon system. No, Mason said. This is the one I never gave them. Jesus, Alton murmured. Show me more. Mason expanded a series of models, dynamic learning engines, autonomous calibration systems, predictive mirrors that built real-time behavioral overlays. His voice steady, precise, unhurried. This was the language he spoke fluently, the one Bell always pretended to understand but never actually did. Alton watched in complete silence, leaning forward, absorbing every detail. When Mason finished, he sat back, letting the data speak for itself. Alton exhaled slowly. Mason, this is revolutionary. It works, Mason replied simply. I've built prototypes. Nova is already operational. Alton stared at him, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in concentration. Bell fired you because she thought she could replace you, he said softly. She thought she owned you. She thought you were manageable. Mason didn't answer. Alton tapped the edge of the tablet. But you built something she never had access to. By design, Mason said. Alton sat back in his chair, silent for another long stretch. The rooftop breeze brushed past them, lifting the edge of the table napkin, tugging at Mason's hair. The city hummed below. Finally, Alton spoke. All right, you're not pitching for a job. It wasn't a question. No, Mason said. I'm not looking to join anyone else's company again. Good, Alton replied. You shouldn't. You'd suffocate. Mason let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Alton drummed his fingers on the table, thinking, calculating. Let me tell you what I see, Mason. I see a man who built an empire and then let someone else take credit. I see a man who's been underestimated by people who weren't fit to carry his toolkit. And I see a man sitting in front of me with a world-changing engine. Alton, no, hear me out. Alton leaned forward, voice low and sharp. You're not coming to me to get revenge on Bell. You're not burning with spite. You're not flailing. That's right, Mason said. I don't want revenge. I want freedom. And there it is. Alton's eyes gleamed. That's the word I was waiting for. Freedom. Autonomy. Control of your work, your future, your name. Mason nodded slowly. Alton placed the tablet down and folded his hands. I'm not offering to hire you. Mason tensed, expecting an offer of employment, a cushy position, something that looked flattering from the outside, but was just another cage. But Alton shook his head. No, someone like you doesn't get hired. A pause. Someone like you gets backed. Mason blinked. Backed. Alton nodded. Funded. Boosted. Ignited. I don't want you working under me. I want you working with me. Mason didn't speak. Couldn't speak. Alton slid a card across the table. A sleek black metal rectangle etched with a single symbol. A lantern with a rising flame. What's this? Mason asked. A name I've been saving, Alton said. For the right idea, the right mind, the right moment. He tapped the card. Project Lantern. Mason lifted it, feeling the weight of the metal, feeling something else, something he hadn't felt in years, settle into his chest. Possibility. Direction. A clean horizon. Alton continued. This would be your venture, your product, your vision. I'll provide capital, contacts, infrastructure. You provide the brilliance. Mason frowned slightly. You're making this sound too simple. Oh, it's not simple, Alton said with a dry laugh. It's risky, expensive, and it'll piss off all the wrong people, which is exactly why I'm interested. Mason couldn't help it, he smiled. Alton pointed at him. There. That look. I knew it. You're not beaten, Mason. You're unshackled. Mason inhaled deeply, the city air filling his lungs. For the first time since Bell's call, he felt aligned with himself again. Think it over if you must, Alton said, standing. But I already know your answer. Mason raised an eyebrow. Do you? Absolutely. Alton placed his hand on the table, firm, confident. Men like you don't crawl back. You build forward. He straightened his jacket, preparing to leave. Then he said one last thing, quiet, sure, unwavering. Let's build Lantern together. Mason didn't respond. Not yet. But Alton was right. The decision was already made. Chapter 6, The Team Bell Threw Away. Mason had spent the morning sketching out the first crude outline of what would become Project Lantern, a loose constellation of ideas on a whiteboard, arrows pointing to boxes, boxes pointing to question marks. Nova pulsed quietly behind him on the main monitor like a heartbeat. But even with Alton's confidence backing him, Mason knew one irrefutable truth. No system, no matter how brilliant, built itself. He needed people. He needed the right people. He needed people who knew what it felt like to be dismissed, underestimated, pushed to the sideline by Bell's corporate empire. He knew exactly where to start. He found Marin Reyes in a tiny cafe across the river, sitting alone with a laptop that looked like it had survived a war zone. Her hair was pulled into a messy braid, and she tapped her stylus against her temple, staring at a design mock-up like it had personally offended her. Mason approached quietly. Is that the new Echelon UI? He asked. She didn't even look up. If by new you mean bland, lifeless, and created by someone who thinks user experience is a type of diet, then yes. Mason smiled. Same Marin, brilliant, sharp, and perpetually at war with mediocre design. When she finally glanced up and saw him, her stylus froze mid-tap. Mason, her voice cracked slightly. Shouldn't you be fired? Exiled? Erased from the company intranet? Mason shrugged. Yes, all of the above. Her face softened, then tightened again with worry. God, I'm so sorry. I heard rumors, but Bell's been on a rampage. I'm aware. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marin pushed her laptop aside and leaned forward, voice low. So, what are you doing here? Mason sat down opposite her. Something new, something real, something that doesn't involve executive egos pretending to innovate. Marin raised an eyebrow. And you came to me because Bell threw you away, Mason said simply. And she never understood what she lost. That hit her. Hard. Marin looked down at her hands. She told me I was too emotional for leadership, that my ideas were impractical. That design wasn't worth building around. It is, Mason said. And I've always believed that. She exhaled shakily, rubbing her thumb over the coffee cup lid. Look, Mason, I appreciate you coming to me. I do, but I can't jump into another mess. Not yet. I'm still. She gestured at the laptop. Recovering. Then don't jump, Mason said softly. Just look. He slid his tablet across the table. Nova's interface glowed on the screen. Clean, intuitive, dynamic, years ahead of anything on the market. Marin's eyes widened. What is this? Nova, Mason said. The real engine I built. The one Echelon never owned. Marin stared, mesmerized. Then her breath caught. Mason, this is beautiful. He nodded. I want you to help shape it. With your vision. Your standards. Not Belle's. Marin closed the tablet slowly, hands trembling with conflict. I want to say yes, she whispered. But I'm scared. I know. She looked up at him, the hesitation raw, honest. Give me a day. Just one. I need to think. Take it, Mason said. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Marin smiled, small, hopeful. Thank you. Damon Ortiz wasn't in a cafe or office or co-working space. Mason found him in the last place he expected. A dim, dusty boxing gym under a freeway bridge. Damon's fists were wrapped. Sweat dripped from his jawline as he hammered a heavy bag like it had personally insulted him. Mason watched from the doorway. Still punching through problems, I see, Mason called. Damon stopped mid-swing, chest heaving. When he turned and saw Mason, he froze. No way. It's me, Mason said. Damon ripped off his gloves, disbelief mixing with relief. Man, I heard Belle fired you, but I thought it was gossip. No gossip. Damon cursed under his breath. She's losing her damn mind. Mason stepped closer. How are things for you? Damon let out a humorless laugh. Well, let's see. Belle demoted me, then promoted some spreadsheet bot who can't analyze a grocery list. Cut my team. Cut my hours. Told me I wasn't forward-thinking enough. He shook his head. I've been job hunting for months. And boxing. Damon glanced at the bag. Cheaper than therapy. Mason nodded. I'm building something new. And I want you. Damon stiffened. Why me? Because you see patterns nobody else sees. Because you're honest. Because you were the best analyst in that building, and Belle treated you like trash. Damon's jaw clenched. His voice turned quiet. It's not that I don't want to leave, Mason. Hell, I want it out for a year. But I've got rent. Family to help. I can't bet everything on a maybe. Mason reached into his bag and handed him a printed model diagram, Nova's behavioral engine. Damon scanned it once, then a second time, then a third. His eyes narrowed. Mason, this is insane. Good insane, Mason said. This thing learns on its own? Yes. And recalibrates in real time? Yes. Damon stared at the diagram like he was holding a piece of forbidden treasure. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Belle had no idea you built this, did she? No, Mason said. She never cared enough to look. Damon swallowed hard, the conflict clear in his eyes. I want in. I really do. But if this collapses, it won't, Mason said firmly. Not because of me, and not because of you. Silence. Then Damon nodded slowly. Give me the weekend, he said. If I do this, I need to do it right. Take your time, Mason replied. And Damon, for the first time in months, looked like he believed in something again. Back at the studio. By dusk, Mason returned to his hidden studio, the glow of Nova reflecting across his face. Two people, two maybes, two sparks waiting for ignition. He sat at his desk and opened his black notebook, the one containing every algorithm, every secret, every plan Belle never owned. He wrote two names, Marin Reyes, UX architecture Damon Ortiz, predictive analytics. He leaned back, breathing deeply. It wasn't a team yet, but it was beginning. And as Nova pulsed quietly beside him, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, momentum. A team Belle threw away, slowly becoming his. Chapter 7, The Quiet Collapse of Echelon. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost imperceptible. A late-night email from a hedge fund complaining about unexpected discrepancies in predictions. A client calling to question anomalies in data models that had previously been flawless. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to prick the nerves of Echelon Global's top brass. Belle stormed through the offices on Monday morning, heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Her usually immaculate composure had cracks. Files were scattered across her desk, printouts of graphs she didn't understand lying in heaps. She swiveled her chair around, glaring at the nearest analyst. Why is the Q4 predictive accuracy down by 14%? She demanded. Explain. The analyst blinked. Ma'am, do not start with excuses. Belle snapped. I want solutions. Meanwhile, Myra hovered nearby, clutching her iPad like it was a lifeline. Her lipstick was smudged from nervous bites. Belle, Maybe we should call Mason. Belle turned sharply. Call Mason? Don't be ridiculous. He's gone. He is out. And we are in control. We are the visionaries here. Her voice cracked slightly as she tried to mask panic with authority. Across the building, murmurs began to spread. Managers whispered behind closed doors. Teams huddled over data terminals, comparing models that just yesterday had been dependable. Clients were sending polite but urgent inquiries. The quiet dissatisfaction was spreading faster than Belle could command a fire drill. The first firing happened mid-morning. An analyst in the predictive modeling team was escorted out by security. Belle claimed a performance review, though it was more a desperate attempt to demonstrate control. Rumors leaked almost immediately. Social media picked up threads from anonymous employees. Myra's voice trembled as she approached Belle's office. Belle, maybe we should address the board before it escalates. They've noticed some discrepancies too. Belle waved her hand dismissively. The board always notices. That's their job. Our job is to act like nothing is wrong. She stood abruptly, pacing. We'll replace anyone who can't keep up. Anyone. Start firing. Random. Send a message. Meanwhile, the predictive engine's errors were quietly compounding. Without the core patches Mason had removed, Aurora, or rather, Echelon's version of it, was straining. The discrepancies were subtle at first. Small miscalculations in trend forecasts, minor deviations in client models. But those small ripples quickly became waves. Stock projections were slightly off. Risk assessments misaligned. Hedge fund clients noticed before anyone else. At the corporate cafe, whispers filled the air. Did you see the Q4 report? One junior analyst said, lowering his voice. I ran it 3 times and got completely different outcomes each time. Something's wrong. Don't panic, another replied, though his face betrayed the opposite. But I think Mason might have had a hand in this. The words hung like smoke in the room. By late afternoon, panic had seeped into upper management. Belle convened a board meeting, trying to project confidence. But the tension was palpable. Graphs showing declining accuracy blinked ominously on screens. Executives muttered, flipping through reports, searching for someone to blame. No one dared suggest Mason, not openly. But the void he left loomed larger than any of them wanted to admit. Belle's voice was sharp as she waved a finger. We need accountability. If you failed, if your department failed, you're gone. Immediately, a mid-level manager protested softly, citing system anomalies, but Belle cut him off. No excuses. I want results, not talk. Start pruning. The room grew tense. Employees avoided eye contact. The fear was thick enough to taste. Myra fidgeted nervously, shoving papers into folders and dropping a few in her haste. Belle, the clients, the board, we can't keep doing this, she whispered. Belle's reply was almost theatrical. We can. We must. This is leadership. Her words rang hollow even to herself. She slammed her fist on the table, sending pens and charts clattering. I am in control. We are in control. Nothing can go wrong under me. But outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the quiet collapse continued. Clients were calling. Emails piled up. Discrepancies grew more glaring. No one in the building knew why. The engineers and analysts panicked, running model after model, patch after patch. But the subtle sabotage Mason had left in place unfolded methodically, imperceptibly, and beyond the capacity of anyone to reverse in real time. From his hidden studio, Mason watched the chaos unfold through public dashboards, client forums, and news snippets. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Instead, he felt something strange, a bittersweet tug in his chest. Echelon was failing, yes, but it could have been different. It could have thrived if Belle had respected what he'd built, if she had understood the systems rather than treating them as tools for ego projection. A quiet sadness settled over him. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. He wasn't cheering for misfortune. He understood the brilliance that could have existed here had leadership been competent and ethical. That potential had been wasted, discarded in the pursuit of personal ambition and vanity. He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced behind his head. Nova's interface blinked softly beside him, a calm, steady contrast to the storms rippling through Echelon. The difference was stark. One system built on trust, precision, and care, the other crumbling under neglect and arrogance. Through the city skyline, Mason glimpsed Echelon's headquarters, the glass tower shining in the setting sun. Inside, panic and confusion reigned, staff scrambling, managers firing, Myra panicking beside Belle. A once great company, now spiraling quietly, almost invisibly. And in that moment, Mason understood something crucial. Control was never about chaos or vengeance. It was about vision, foresight, and respect for what you create. Belle had none of that. Myra had none of that. And the company's collapse, quiet and unstoppable, was simply the inevitable outcome of that failure. Mason took a deep breath, listening to the faint hum of Nova in his studio. No celebration, no exultation, only the quiet knowledge that the world he had built, the work he had nurtured, was still alive, still capable, still true to its purpose. As the evening deepened, public forums began buzzing with speculation. Clients whispered. Analysts grew anxious. Belle's fury intensified behind the closed doors of her office. Myra's panic became more obvious. The board started asking pointed questions, nervously flipping through reports. Echelon's foundation, once solid, now trembled under the strain of missing expertise, missing integrity, and missing foresight. Mason leaned back in his chair, gazing at the city lights. There was no triumph in watching the quiet collapse. Only clarity. The threads had been pulled. The unraveling had begun. Chapter 8, The Investors Summit. The lobby of the Summit Hotel was already buzzing when Mason and Alton arrived. Glass doors swung open, revealing a polished atrium filled with investors, analysts, journalists, and a faint scent of expensive coffee and leather-bound portfolios. The air hummed with anticipation, the kind of nervous electricity that only appeared before major financial announcements. Alton strode beside him, calm and unshakable, the picture of a man accustomed to controlling rooms and reading people before they even spoke. Mason followed, deliberately composed, as if the waves of anticipation around him couldn't touch his core. "Relax," Alton whispered as they passed the registration desk. "You know this. You built it. They just don't realize it yet." "I know," Mason replied, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. His eyes scanned the crowd, not in arrogance, but in calculated observation. Every subtle gesture, every nervous glance, every whispered aside was a piece of data, just like Nova would analyze. They reached the private conference hall. The velvet ropes and gold-trimmed doors led into a space that could easily hold 1,000 people, though today it only needed to hold a few hundred of the most powerful investors in the country. The staff greeted Alton with respect, Mason with polite curiosity. Few knew who he was. Fewer still realized he held the keys to the future they were about to witness. "Here's the stage," Alton murmured. "Take a breath. Walk out, own it. Nova speaks for itself." Mason nodded. He stepped onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, the bright lights warming his face. Screens stretched across the room, ready to project his presentation. He could hear the quiet hum of chatter in the audience, the low murmur of investment portfolios and egos colliding. He activated Nova. Instantly, the interface lit up on the massive screen behind him. A sleek, dynamic system of real-time predictive analytics. Lines of data moved seamlessly, updating, calibrating, learning. Nova was more than a program. It was a living algorithm. "Good afternoon," Mason began, voice steady and calm, projecting not just words but presence. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. What I'm about to show you is not just technology. It's the evolution of predictive intelligence, built on ethics, transparency, and precision." Investors leaned forward in their seats. A few murmured, skeptical but intrigued. Mason continued, clicking through live demonstrations. Nova recalibrated financial forecasts in seconds, optimizing predictions with an elegance that made existing systems look primitive. He showed ethical decision layers, risk mitigations, bias detection, and a transparent audit trail. One investor whispered to another, "Is this actually real?" Mason smiled faintly, without breaking composure. "It's very real." He paused, letting the screens display a series of live simulations. Market fluctuations, investment strategies, even disaster modeling. Nova adjusted instantaneously, highlighting optimal outcomes while maintaining full ethical compliance. He walked closer to the audience, gesturing with calm authority. Most predictive systems prioritize results over responsibility. They exploit data, optimize profit at all costs. Nova does not. Nova balances precision with integrity, accuracy with transparency. It is designed to adapt, to learn, and to provide insight that is both actionable and ethically sound. A prominent venture capitalist raised a hand. "And you're telling us this has been operational for how long?" Mason's gaze remained unwavering. "Operational and testing for months. Fully functional in its live form for weeks. Every projection you're seeing is based on real-time data, processed through algorithms I designed from the ground up." Alton, seated just to Mason's side, gave him a subtle nod of approval. Mason took a breath, letting the room absorb it. The investors were no longer polite. They were curious, calculating, ready to act. He transitioned seamlessly, demonstrating Nova's adaptability to complex scenarios, merging market insights, behavioral analytics, and risk assessment models. He showed simulations where traditional engines failed catastrophically, while Nova recalculated and corrected in real time. A wave of quiet astonishment moved through the audience. Some investors leaned back, eyes wide. Others whispered rapidly into tablets and phones. Mason remained composed, confident, hands resting lightly on the podium. Every gesture was measured, every glance intentional. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mason concluded, "Nova is not just a system. It is a platform for ethical, intelligent decision-making at scale. It is designed to evolve with the challenges of the modern market, and it is ready for implementation today." The room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then the first applause broke out, tentative, then growing steadily into a chorus. Investors exchanged looks, some reaching for tablets to commit funds. One woman rose, speaking quickly into her phone. "Yes, I want in. Send the legal framework." Alton leaned in, voice low but audible. "See? I told you." Mason's eyes swept the room. Not a single investor looked unconvinced. Some nodded, some scribbled notes, some whispered urgently to colleagues. The current of approval was palpable. Commitments, tentative at first, began to flow. Mason could see it, read it like data in Nova's interface. Pledges of capital, partnership inquiries, immediate interest in pilot programs. He remained composed, letting the power of the system and the clarity of his vision do the work. No theatrics, no ego, just control, confidence, and a quietly undeniable brilliance. Even Alton, the veteran, leaned back, visibly impressed. "They're eating out of your hand," he murmured. Mason allowed himself a brief nod, a faint acknowledgement of the truth. They were. Every investor in that room now understood that this wasn't just another predictive tool. This was the future. This was Nova. And he, Mason Clark, was at the center, not a subordinate, not an employee, not a forgotten genius in the shadows. The summit continued around him, but Mason's focus never wavered. Nova's performance, the audience's reactions, the subtle nods and wide-eyed stares, all of it confirmed what he already knew. The system worked. The ethical, intelligent, precise future was here, and he was in full control. The first of many commitments blinked on the projection screen. A substantial sum from a major hedge fund. A second followed from a technology venture consortium. A third arrived almost immediately from an international investor, drawn in by the system's sophistication and Mason's credibility. He allowed himself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but because the culmination of years of work, of planning, patience, and unshakable vision was finally manifesting exactly as it should. Chapter 9, Bell bursts in. The room was silent except for the faint hum of Nova's interface and the occasional keystroke from Mason's team. Every screen in the summit hall glowed with dynamic projections, live data, predictive models, and the real-time recalibrations that made Nova unlike anything the investors had ever seen. Mason had reached the climax of his presentation, walking through a complex market simulation that demonstrated Nova's ethical decision layers and precision forecasting. Alton Morrow sat beside him, leaning back slightly, his arms crossed, exuding the calm confidence of a man who knew the future was about to shift. Mason's voice carried effortlessly, measured and calm, each sentence purposeful. And as you can see, Mason said, clicking to the final simulation, Nova doesn't just predict, it learns, adapts, and respects boundaries. It operates on a level of transparency and integrity that is unmatched. These results are live, accurate, and actionable. Every decision made by Nova can be audited in real time, ensuring not just profitability, but ethical compliance as well. A hush settled over the audience. Investors leaned forward, whispers running like a current through the room. Tablets flashed, notebooks scribbled furiously. Mason didn't pause. He let the system speak, letting the algorithms, the interface, the live recalibrations demonstrate what words alone could never capture. And then, doors slammed open. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Heads snapped toward the entrance. Belle Clark stood there, perfectly coiffed, designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, her expression a mix of fury and disbelief. Myra was behind her, clutching her iPad like a shield. Both of them froze. The entire room turned. Cameras snapped instinctively, flashes illuminating the sudden disruption. Investors murmured, some standing instinctively. Belle's eyes locked on Mason, who remained seated, calm, unflinching, and completely in control. Mason, she said, her voice brittle but attempting authority. What are you doing here? Mason looked up slowly, meeting her gaze without emotion. Presenting Nova, he said simply, with our investors. Belle's mouth opened, then closed. She took a tentative step forward. That system, that technology belongs to Echelon. You have no right. Actually, Mason said, leaning back slightly, voice deliberate, and even, it doesn't. The room quieted further, every investor now fully attentive. Belle's eyes narrowed, disbelief registering. I own the original IP. Mason continued, calm, unshaken. You never signed the transfer contracts. Echelon has been using my engine illegally for years. The patents are registered and fully in my name, and the access keys expire tonight. The words fell like ice in the room. A ripple of astonishment ran through the investors. They glanced at one another, whispering rapidly, calculating implications. Myra shifted nervously, glancing at Belle, then at Mason. Belle's posture faltered slightly. She swallowed, attempting to regain control. That's impossible, Belle stammered, though her voice wavered under the weight of reality. You can't just Echelon, yes. Mason interrupted softly, still seated, still composed. I can, and I have. The boardroom of investors was no longer a passive audience. Tablets were up, emails being typed, phones pressed to ears. The room had shifted in an instant from curiosity to urgency. Commitment meetings paused. Whispers turned into murmurs of astonishment. Belle stepped forward, voice raised now, try to reclaim dominance. This is corporate theft. You have no right to. You misunderstand, Mason said, voice calm but firm. This isn't theft. It's ownership. I created the engine. I safeguarded the IP. Everything you see here, Echelon has been using without proper authorization. And tonight that ends. The investors leaned back, some shaking their heads, some whispering to legal counsel, some simply staring in awe. The realization hit Belle like a tidal wave. She had no leverage. Her company had relied on Mason's work, but legally, he controlled it. She had been overconfident, assuming the board and investors would support her claims. Now, every assumption was collapsing in real time. Myra tugged at Belle's arm. Maybe we should. No. Belle snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes darted nervously across the audience. Each gaze she met, each investor's calculating stare, chipped away at her authority. Mason rose slowly from his seat, approaching the stage with deliberate steps. He didn't need to assert dominance with volume or theatrics. His calm, measured movements, coupled with the undeniable presence of Nova on the screens behind him, said more than any speech could. "You see," Mason continued, projecting confidence without aggression, "Nova is fully operational, fully mine, and fully ready for implementation. Your investments, your partnerships, your strategies, they're secure because they are transparent, ethical, and above all, accurate. Echelon, meanwhile, is left with, well, the appearance of technology without the substance." He paused. Investors were leaning forward, completely absorbed. Some whispered to their colleagues. Others tapped on tablets, reviewing contracts, analyzing data, calculating next steps. Belle realized she was trapped, not by confrontation, not by force, but by the incontrovertible facts Mason had laid out. Belle faltered, attempting one last assertion. "You can't. Echelon is." Mason held up a hand, gentle but final. "I've done everything correctly. Legally. Ethically. And yes, the keys expire tonight." A wave of stunned silence washed over the room. Investors were now fully attentive, some nodding subtly, others openly discussing next steps with their peers. Belle's attempted dominance had crumbled entirely. Myra's panic was evident. The younger woman clutched her tablet, eyes wide, scanning documents she didn't understand fast enough. Belle looked around, seeing the investors' unwavering focus on Mason, not her. Every attempt at assertion faltered. Every argument was dead before it left her lips. The room had shifted irrevocably, and in that moment, Mason understood something profound. It wasn't the confrontation, the drama, or the theatrics that secure the upper hand. It was clarity, preparation, and ownership. Belle realized it too, though much too late. She had nothing to leverage, nothing to negotiate, no authority to assert. Only the stark, undeniable truth. She had miscalculated completely. The investors turned fully to Mason, anticipation and approval in their eyes. Belle's lips parted, the words dying in her throat. Myra looked on helplessly, caught between panic and disbelief. Chapter 10, The $500 million Twist. The summit hall was tense, thick with anticipation. Investors buzzed quietly among themselves, tablets and phones in hand, occasionally glancing toward Mason as he stood confidently near the center of the room. Nova's interface projected across the massive screens behind him, its flowing algorithms and live recalibrations mesmerizing everyone present. The system's brilliance was undeniable. Belle, still attempting to assert control despite her previous humiliation, had regained a tenuous composure. She stood at the side of the room, arms crossed, pacing slightly, whispering to Myra. "She's going to try to stop him before the deal closes." Mason observed silently to Alton, who was seated calmly in the front row. "She thinks she still has time." Alton's lips curved into a faint smile. "She doesn't. Not anymore." Mason took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the subtle murmurs in the room settle. Investors leaned forward, their eyes trained on him, waiting for the next move. Mason had already walked them through Nova's ethical architecture, its predictive accuracy, and the live simulations. Commitments had begun to flow. Phones were buzzing. Contracts were being reviewed. The momentum was unstoppable. Belle, oblivious to the depth of the preparation, finally stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Mason," she began, trying to sound authoritative, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her panic. "You don't understand what you're doing. This technology, Nova, is property of Echelon. You can't." Mason raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. He turned to face the room fully, not to Belle, but to the audience. Investors immediately followed his gaze. His voice, calm, steady, commanding, filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mason said, "there's something important I need to clarify." He paused, letting the attention of every investor settle on him. "Many of you may believe this deal is still pending, that the outcome is uncertain, that there's an opportunity for negotiation at the last minute. Belle's eyes narrowed. Mason, don't, I assure you. Mason continued, undeterred. There is no negotiation left. Nova has already been acquired. The $500 million deal you are witnessing is already closed. A stunned silence swept the room. Investors froze, glancing at one another in disbelief. Tablets buzzed furiously, emails were sent, fingers tapped across keyboards. The sheer scale of the news hit like a shockwave. Nova, the system they had been evaluating live, was no longer a hypothetical investment. It was already in motion legally, financially, and irrevocably. Belle's face paled. Her carefully constructed composure cracked. What are you saying? Her voice was rising, breaking now, a mixture of fury and panic. You can't, this is illegal. The deal, Echelon, everything was done transparently, legally, and with all due diligence. Mason said softly, almost kindly. Alton and I finalized the acquisition hours before this meeting. All contracts signed, all funds secured. The deal is complete. Nova is no longer a potential, it is a reality. Her lips parted in disbelief. Myra's eyes widened. The magnitude of what had just been revealed crashed over them. Belle had imagined she could intervene at the last moment, perhaps insert herself into the negotiations, perhaps regain control, perhaps salvage a fragment of leverage. Instead, the reality was cruel and undeniable. She had already lost everything. Murmurs grew in the hall. Investors whispered to one another, murmuring confirmations and congratulations. Some stood, tapping their devices, reviewing legal confirmations. The magnitude of the acquisition, $500 million, was staggering. Belle's hands trembled at her sides. She took a hesitant step forward, almost instinctively reaching for a laptop on the podium, as if she could undo the transaction with a single keystroke. Myra tried to intervene, placing a hand on her sister's arm. No, stop, Myra whispered, but Belle's gaze was locked on Mason. Her voice cracked, loud and frantic. This isn't over. Echelon owns the contracts. You can't just... Mason's expression remained calm, unshaken, controlled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step toward her. Instead, he let the room, the evidence, and the law speak. Echelon has no ownership over Nova. I retain the original IP. All patents are registered in my name. The access keys expire tonight. The legal framework for this acquisition is airtight. This deal is final. Investors' eyes widened as they registered the implications. Every whisper in the room shifted from speculation to astonishment. Emails pinged as confirmations were sent. Phones rang as executives confirmed wire transfers. The weight of $500 million had already shifted, and it was no longer within Belle's grasp to influence it. Belle staggered slightly, catching herself on the edge of the table. Her carefully cultivated image, the one she had relied on for years, the authority she had wielded over Echelon, crumbled visibly. Myra's face mirrored her own panic, both realizing the full scope of the disaster before them. Alton, seated near Mason, allowed a small, satisfied nod. He leaned toward Mason and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. She's realized she's already lost. Mason exhaled quietly. He did not smile. He did not gloat. There was no vindication in watching Belle face the consequences. There was only the clarity of truth. Preparation, foresight, and integrity had won. The room buzzed, the investors alive with energy, reviewing the final contracts, discussing integration strategies, and planning next steps. Nova's acquisition was complete. Mason's vision, execution, and patience had secured it. Belle's eyes darted around, desperately searching for any loophole, any leverage, any way to reclaim control. But it wasn't there. Every document, every investor, every legal detail confirmed the same harsh truth. She had been outmaneuvered completely, and the $500 million she thought she might intercept had already slipped through her fingers. Her lips trembled. Her hand shook. Myra's small voice attempted to reach her sister, but Belle could not hear it. The room was no longer hers. The deal was no longer hers. The reputation she had spent years cultivating was now in ruins before her very eyes. Mason watched quietly from the front of the room, letting the weight of the moment settle over Belle, Myra, and the assembled investors. Nova's interface pulsed behind him, calm, precise, and unwavering, like its creator. Chapter 11, The Call That Comes Too Late. The city was quiet that night, unusually still for a metropolis that never truly slept. Mason sat in his studio, the glow of Nova reflecting softly on his face, casting gentle shadows across the walls stacked with black notebooks and schematics. The hum of servers filled the room, a calm, steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Everything was in place. The deal was closed. Nova was acquired. The investors were satisfied. The future he had envisioned was already unfolding. Then his phone rang. The screen displayed Belle's name. Mason's thumb hovered over the answer button for a moment longer than necessary. He could have ignored it. Part of him wanted to, but he didn't. He pressed the green icon. Hello. Mason. Belle's voice cracked instantly, brittle and small, unlike the commanding, sharp tone he had heard all these years. It was a sound he barely recognized. Panic, regret, and exhaustion all laced her words. Mason, please, she hesitated, as though the right words were impossible to find. I lost myself. I got carried away with ambition, with fear, and I didn't see what I was doing. I didn't see me. I didn't see us. Mason listened quietly, letting her voice tumble over him. He didn't speak immediately. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence. He let her unpack the weight she had been carrying, the shame she had never admitted, the mistakes she had refused to confront until now. I thought I could control it all, Belle continued, voice trembling. The company, the tech, even you. I thought I was smart enough, clever enough to manage everything. But I wasn't. Mason, her words caught in a sob. Mason leaned back in his chair, hands clasped lightly in front of him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Her guilt and despair were already speaking louder than any argument she could make. What would it take, she whispered finally, almost desperately, to undo this? To fix it? To make things right? Mason's voice was calm, even gentle. He chose his words carefully. Belle, nothing. It's already done. There was a pause on the line. He could hear her inhale sharply, as if the weight of those words was physically pressing down on her. Nothing, she repeated, disbelief edged with desperation. You mean it's too late? He nodded, though she couldn't see him. Yes, it's too late. Silence fell again. Belle's breathing came in shaky gasps, and Mason could almost hear the realization building inside her, the understanding that she had no control, no leverage, no way to reverse what had already happened. I didn't mean for it to end like this, she whispered finally, voice breaking entirely. I thought if I worked harder, if I stayed in control, I could keep it all. Keep you. Keep Echelon. Keep everything. Mason remained silent, letting her speak, letting the raw honesty spill over. He didn't need to scold her. He didn't need to gloat. There was no pleasure in this moment, no triumph. Only clarity. You lost, he said softly. Not angrily, not harshly, simply, plainly, because you forgot the most important part, integrity, foresight, respect for what you didn't create. You can't control what you didn't build. You can't claim what you didn't earn. Her voice wavered. Mason, do you hate me? He shook his head, even though she couldn't see. No, I don't hate you. He could feel her shift in the silence on the other end of the line, listening intently, hoping for something else, some vindication, some mercy. I pity you. That's all. For what you've lost, for what you've never understood, and for the person you thought you could be but weren't willing to become. There was a long pause. Then she whispered, almost to herself, I can't fix any of it, can I? No, Mason said gently. You can't. The line went quiet for a moment. He could hear the faint tremor of her breath, the soft metallic click of a lock of her hair brushing her cheek. And then nothing. She had no more words, no more defenses, no more attempts to regain control. The truth had hit her fully and completely. The company, the deal, the reputation, Even the future she had imagined for herself, all gone. Mason lowered his phone slightly, resting it lightly against his ear. He didn't hang up immediately. He didn't need to. There was no further confrontation necessary. No additional explanations required. She had understood. That realization was sufficient. "Goodbye, Belle," he said softly, almost tenderly. Not bitter, not triumphant, just final. Belle's voice cracked again, a single, quiet sigh over the line. Then the connection ended. The line went dead. Mason held the phone for a moment, letting the silence envelop him, letting the hum of Nova fill the room once more. He didn't celebrate. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of completion. Everything he had worked for, every safeguard, every plan, every patient, precise step he had taken, it had led to this moment. He had protected what he had created, and he had done so without malice. He placed the phone gently on the desk, leaning back in his chair. Nova pulsed quietly beside him, alive, vigilant, and unwavering. Mason allowed himself a slow breath, the tension of the past months finally easing from his shoulders. In that quiet studio, he realized the depth of the finality. Belle's apology, her regrets, her desperate questioning, they came too late. Nothing could undo what had been set in motion. He had secured the integrity of his work, the independence of his vision, and the future he had fought for. And as the city lights twinkled through the windows, reflected faintly in the glass surfaces of his studio, Mason understood fully that this was not triumph over a person. It was the reclamation of identity, of purpose, of control over his own life and creation. Belle had called him, seeking redemption, asking what could be done. He had given her the truth, gentle, firm, and irrevocable. Nothing. It was already done. Chapter 12. The Fall and the Rise. The morning after the summit, the city was alive with whispers and headlines. News outlets, financial forums, and social media feeds erupted simultaneously. Echelon Global was embroiled in an intellectual property scandal. Articles detailed months of unauthorized use of Mason's predictive analytics engine, citing missing contracts, expired access keys, and the airtight patents Mason had held all along. Belle's name was front and center. Myra's too. Every mention painted a picture of arrogance, recklessness, and hubris. Investors, clients, and board members scrambled. Phone calls rang incessantly. Emails flooded inboxes. The once pristine image of Echelon Global cracked like fragile glass under the weight of undeniable truth. Inside Echelon's towering headquarters, chaos had replaced the usual corporate precision. Belle and Myra were summoned to an emergency board meeting. They entered the glass-walled conference room, heels clicking against the polished marble, their faces masks of composure attempting to hide panic. But the board did not wait for theatrics. Belle, Myra, the chair of the board said, voice cold and controlled, "It has come to our attention that Echelon has been operating using intellectual property without authorization. The evidence is irrefutable. Contracts were never signed. Patents are in another party's name. Access keys have expired. Your continued presence as executives is untenable." Belle's lips pressed into a thin line. We can explain. You will not." Another board member interjected sharply. "This is not up for discussion. Effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties. Security will escort you from the premises." Belle's eyes darted to Myra, who looked on pale and trembling. This is absurd," Belle hissed, her voice shaking. "I built this company." The board remained silent. Their faces were unmoved, their authority absolute. Belle's protests fell flat, powerless against the weight of evidence. Security arrived, uniforms crisp, expressions neutral. Without a word, they moved toward the sisters. Belle's voice rose one final time, desperate. "You can't just—" But the officers were firm. Myra clutched her tablet like a shield as they escorted them down the gleaming halls. The staff watched silently. Some stared in disbelief. Others whispered quietly among themselves. Cameras in the building's corridors captured the moment. Belle and Myra leaving not with triumph, but with the quiet defeat of those who had underestimated the consequences of their own actions. Outside, a few of the remaining executives murmured to one another, contemplating damage control and client reassurance. Echelon was wounded, its reputation fractured, its leadership gone. Meanwhile, Mason was far away in his studio. He didn't watch the chaos unfold with a sense of victory. He didn't smile or revel in the downfall of those who had wronged him. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, letting the silence of his workspace surround him. The hum of Nova was a calm constant, a reminder of purpose preserved and vision realized. He turned to Alton, who had been quietly coordinating with investors throughout the aftermath. "It's done," Mason said softly. Not triumphantly, not maliciously, just matter of fact. Alton nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It is. And now you rebuild." And rebuild he did. Project Lantern became Mason's new reality. Gone were the layers of corporate politics, the stifling hierarchies, the endless compromises. He assembled a team of loyal, talented individuals. Marin, Damon, and others who had believed in integrity, innovation, and transparency long before Mason's name became widely known. Together, they began building an open, collaborative environment where ideas could thrive unrestrained. Mason worked tirelessly to secure retroactive licensing agreements, ensuring that all previous legal entanglements were resolved cleanly. Every step was meticulous, every detail checked, every contract reviewed. By doing so, he reclaimed what had been taken, not with malice, but with precision and professionalism. He also regained his home, a sanctuary that Bell had once tried to control. Walking through the familiar rooms, Mason felt a profound sense of ownership, not just of property, but of life, of choices, of freedom. Each room, each corner, each personal touch reflected years of thought, care, and work. For the first time in a long time, the space felt fully his. In the new office of Project Lantern, Mason watched his team collaborate openly. Whiteboards filled with sketches, algorithms, and flowcharts. Screens displayed live updates of Nova's applications. Discussions flowed freely. Critiques were welcomed. Ideas built upon each other. The contrast to Echelon's suffocating hierarchy was stark. Here, creativity and integrity were the currency. Here, Mason's vision could breathe fully. He paused for a moment, stepping to a window that looked out over the city skyline. The city lights reflected in the glass, bright and alive, and he felt the quiet thrill of possibility. Every past injustice, every betrayal, every obstacle had been a lesson, a preparation for this moment. Returning to his desk, Mason opened a new notebook, a fresh black leather cover, empty pages waiting to be filled. He began writing the roadmap for Nova 2.0. Every algorithm, every protocol, every enhancement plan meticulously. This was not about revenge, not about proving a point. It was about reclamation. It was about creating something enduring, something ethical, something wholly his. Marin walked by, glancing at the pages. "This is ambitious," she said, smiling. Mason looked up, returning a calm, focused gaze. "It has to be. The world deserves more than just prediction. It deserves insight, fairness, and truth." Damon leaned on the doorway, observing Nova running simulations across multiple sectors. "You're building more than technology," he remarked. "You're building trust." Mason nodded. The hum of the servers filled the room, steady and assuring, as if echoing the rhythm of his regained life. He placed his pen down briefly, observing the team moving fluidly, discussing strategy, debating, iterating. The energy was alive, organic, real. He picked up the pen again, tracing precise lines, jotting notes, outlining enhancements, and mapping out future capabilities. Every stroke reaffirmed his autonomy, his purpose, and his reclaimed narrative. He was no longer defined by what Bell had tried to take from him. For the first time in years, Mason felt the depth of being fully himself. Free from manipulation, free from pretense, free from control that was never rightfully anyone else's. He was the author of his own life again. Outside, the city moved on unaware of the quiet triumph in Mason's office. But inside, Within the walls of Project Lantern, something profound was happening. The rise of integrity, the restoration of vision, and the enduring truth that success was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming one's identity. Mason's eyes rested on the last line of his outline for Nova 2.0. He leaned back, pen finally still, and allowed himself a moment of calm. The journey had been long, treacherous, and deeply personal, but it had led him here to clarity, autonomy, and a life built entirely on his own terms.